This is easily the most intimidating video that I have ever filmed. I said that actually last year at the beginning of the Gunslinger video that I filmed, and it was true then, and it's definitely true now. I mean, just look at how long it took me to get here. Last year, I committed to doing one book a month for The Dark Tower for my reread. I did every book all the way up to this one. I even read this one when I was supposed to on time, but the video never came. And to be quite honest, I just couldn't figure out what I wanted to say about the book and the series as a whole, or how to even begin to approach that in the first place. Because you see, reading was always a chore for me. I didn't actually enjoy it. And then when I was 20, I found The Gunslinger. And I ran through this entire series, and it changed everything for me. It changed reading for me. It broke reading wide open. And it can be different for everybody. For somebody, it might be The Lord of the Rings, or The Wheel of Time, or The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I mean, take your pick. But for me, it was The Dark Tower. Also, I think that this book has one of the greatest endings ever written, period. And I say that very unironically. And this is coming from a man, Stephen King, who is notorious for writing bad endings, or at least so the general consensus seems to be. And that's not even to say that this is a perfect book, because it definitely has some major flaws. It even has a couple of really bad climaxes, one of which I think is actually proof that Stephen King at times can be a better writer than we are as readers, and the other bad climax is just bad. But we'll get there. This will be a video discussing The Dark Tower, Book 7 in the Dark Tower series. I will be discussing major plot points all the way through the video up to and including the ending of the book itself. So just fair warning, this is full-blown spoilers right from the get-go. I also do want to say thank you to my patrons before I get too far into this one. I know one in particular is a big Dark Tower fan, so let's go. The book starts right off with a bang, with Callahan and Jake taking on the vampires, and Susanna separated from Mia, giving birth to Mordred. And it's absolutely fucking intense. It's amazing. It's great. It's dramatic. It's dynamic. It's all the great things. And it delivers on everything that the previous book had been building up to in sense of climax and dramatic payoff that you really would want from this section of the book. But in hindsight, it's actually, to be honest, probably the least memorable section of the entire book, because from here, we're really going to move into the payoffs for the entire series as a whole. And that is what you will ultimately, or at least I ultimately, ended up carrying with me through all the years, and then rereading them, they are just so much more impactful than the opening action could be as well. Not to diminish the opening action, because it is truly wonderful. I'm just saying, it's only up from here. Also, I really do love Mordred. He's kind of like absolute nightmare fuel in the best King way, because he's just this creepy creature, hybrid, man, spider, shapeshifter, which would be nightmare fuel enough if King didn't imbue it with like this childlike mentality and with its own sense of humanity, and just he has a way of just humanizing and characterizing everything he touches, and doing it to the creepy Mordred thing just makes it that much more frightening, because you can see how a child would react or overreact or extend in certain situations, and then mixing that with the OP nature of its being, OP nature of its abilities and its strength. Yeah, scary shit. Anyway, after all the drama from the beginning of the book happens, the group ends up meeting back up and goes on their way. And now they're being stalked by the creepy Mordred thing, when suddenly one of those really bad climaxes happened. And I can't even really delay talking about it because we're already there. This is one of the ones that everybody hates. I hated it just as much as everybody else hated it. I really thought that this was one of the worst writing decisions I had ever seen in my life. I was so unsatisfied. I was so let down, and it took me months to come to terms with what just happened in this book. That is, Mordred kills Walter. Walter, in all of his arrogance and all of his hubris and all of his machinations, attempts to kill Mordred. He had him birthed just so he could kill him and take his birthmark so that he could go and enter the tower. And in all of his scheming, this one finally backfires on him. And like I said, it took me months to come to terms with this, because this is the scene that proved to me that Stephen King is a better writer than I am as a reader. Because this isn't what I wanted. What I wanted was an epic showdown between Roland and Walter. It has been teased. It has been set up. We have been jonesing for this thing since the man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. This is what we were supposed to have, right? And in the end, that's not what we got, because what we got is this. And Stephen King is such a character first writer. Everything is character first. He writes these characters. He lives with these characters. They are people to him. And he's said in the past that he doesn't know what a character is going to do until they do it. Famously, Stephen King is not an outliner. He doesn't plan things. He just starts writing, and he goes where the story takes him. He goes where the characters take him. When he is met with a roadblock, and the characters have to make a decision, that character makes that decision. It doesn't matter if he would have had a plan or an outline for them to go left. When he's faced with that decision, if it only makes sense for his character to go right, then they're going to go right. Period. To hell with any outlining, character first. And he just kind of wings it. He just doesn't hide this. He really makes it clear in interviews when he talks about it that he doesn't outline. The story goes where it's going to go, and he just kind of writes it down as it happens before his eyes. This is an example of that, because this is an example of Walter dying in the best possible way that Walter could have died. The best way for his character, the best way for the story, the best way, period. Because does he go out in some epic, grand, glorious fight with Roland? No. He goes down as a victim of his own bullshit scheming. And finally, after thousands of years of plans and schemes and fucking people over and stabbing people in the back and working in the back, because he doesn't fight his own fights. He's not going to fight Roland. He would never dare do that. Why would he fight Roland when he can scheme in the background and he can create this monster spider or some other machine or creature to fight Roland for him? And finally, all of his scheming and all of his planning and everything sneaks up on him and bites him in the ass and ultimately takes him out. And it took me a while, but I eventually came to terms with the fact that this is it. This is the right way to do it. It's not what I wanted. I was unsatisfied. It would have been so much more satisfying to have an epic showdown between Roland and Walter, but it wouldn't have been as good for the characters as this was. And I stand by that. It took me a long time to figure that out. As hard as it was to come to terms with, I had to admit that what I wanted was nowhere near as good thematically as this is, or as appropriate for the characters. Now, if you can get past all of that, then we get to the section with the breakers. And this is another section of the book that's just perfection, because it is so epic and it's so climactic and it feels so grand, because we're 7 books in and this is it. This is, the beams are breaking, and if the beams break, the tower falls. And if the tower falls, all of existence comes down. And we are here now with the breakers that are breaking the beams, and we feel that weight and those stakes and that tension. And at the same time, we are now tying in all of these other things from all these other Stephen King books, all of these psychic people with the touch and the shine. You feel the weight of not just these 7 books, but all the other King books in the multiverse. If you've read other King books, you feel the weight of that because the touch or these breakers is the shine. You could very theoretically have Danny Torrance sitting here in this group breaking beams because that would be his ability in this book. It's just, you really start to feel the weight of all of King's work coming to bear and coming to fruition as we're getting to the breakers. And you don't have to read those other books. I hadn't read those books when I read this the first time, and I still felt the weight of it. And now that I have read those other books, or at least a lot of them, I now feel the weight of the multiverse. And I'm just like, this is really fantastic. And it's scalable because if you don't have it, it feels big. And if you do have it, it just feels a little bit bigger. That's all really. It's really good. At the same time, this section of the book reunites us with some old friends from earlier in the series. And you feel that too. You feel all of the hope and the joy of getting to see these old friends and the reunion, and we save the breakers and we stop the breaking of the beams, essentially saving the Dark Tower itself. And in the process, the Tet breaks. We lose Eddie. We lose our first member of the group. And in doing so, by losing any member of the Tet's essentially broken. And it hurts. Like, it really hurts to lose one of the members, especially Eddie. Even though Eddie, if I'm being totally honest, was probably my least favorite member of the group. I know there's a lot of people that are real Eddie fans out there. I wasn't. I'm kind of a Jake kind of guy, but either way, you've spent 7 books now just growing to know and falling in love with these characters, and we lose our first one. You feel it so much, but this is how it goes, right? Like, this is where this is going. Nobody's confused here. Nobody thought that we were going to all approach the tower holding hands and singing Kumbaya, right? Like, nobody was confused about how this book was going to play out. At least I wasn't. I mean, the story is Roland to the Dark Tower came. It's not Roland and all of his buddies ran up there holding hands and singing. This has been foreshadowed for 7 books. He has been told repeatedly, over and over and over again, everybody who walks with you dies. Unless you were hoping for some grand, we defy all odds and all fate, and fate means nothing because I don't know what. But no, we've been basically told this at face value for a long time, that Roland completes this journey alone, and the people that try to stand by his side as he does this will ultimately fall. And now the first domino has officially fallen. This will then lead to Jake and Roland going to save Stephen King. And love it or hate it, Stephen King's back in the story. He put himself back in there again. And I still stand by what I said the last time of it is very weird. It kind of pulls you out of the story a little bit, but it's done well. If you're going to write yourself into a story, I don't know if I'd recommend that, but if you're going to do it, this would be the way to do it. And it is extremely well executed for what it is. But anyway, now Jake dies. And this section hit me harder than the last one, if I'm being honest, because like I said, I'm a Jake kind of guy. And the section with Roland where he has to take Jake out and kind of mourn him by himself, alone, without Susanna or anybody, and has to bury him, and just kind of the feels that you get back from book 1 where he sacrificed Jake, and now here where he has to see Jake die again, but this time he has to deal with the aftermath himself and essentially bury the body. You're just, oh my God, it's intense. You feel it to the very bottom of your soul. Anyway, then we get to Dandelo. And I really didn't plan on going through this book like beat by beat. I was just going to hit some of the major plot points as I go through. And the more I started to go through it, I was like, God, I got to talk about that, don't I? So we're going to talk about Dandelo. And it's just because this section of the book, I really, really loved it on a reread. I actually, when I was rereading it, got to the section in it's Dandelo, and it's just got this real dark fairy tale kind of a vibe to it as they come up to it and they go into the house and then they have this dealings with Dandelo. And I almost didn't even, I like literally didn't even really remember it from the first time that I read it because so much other stuff, so many bigger things are happening around it, before it, after it. Then when I was rereading the book, I'm like, I don't even remember this shit. But it's so haunting and beautiful, and the way that just that little section of the book is written, I just wanted to give a little shout out to it because it was so good. I don't know, I loved it. There's so much going on here, and there's so much payoff that stuff like the Dandelo section and just the haunted fairy tale nature of it can get lost in the mix of everything else that's happening. So shout out Dandelo. Now, immediately after this, Susanna leaves. And this is another example of character first. Because I honestly thought when I was reading this that she was going to die too. I really expected everyone to die. And then when it gets to the point where everyone is dying, Susanna's like, you know what? I'm peace. I'm good. She's like me. She's like, I'm no idiot. I know where this is going. Everybody who walks with you dies. I just watched those two go. I'm out. You got this, right? I'll be over here in Otherworld. Go draw me a door, Patrick. But for real, this is another example of character first. Because if it was any other member of the Tet, they would have stuck with him. They would have died. Jake would have gone with him to the tower. Eddie would have gone with him to the tower. The only one who would have said peace is Susanna. Had she been the one to die at Thunderclap, the entire Tet would have died in this book because nobody else would have walked out on Roland. She's the only member of the group that would say, you know what? I see where this is going, and I'm going to choose to walk away because you're going to do this alone. You were meant to do this alone, and I don't think I'm meant to be there, so I don't know what else I can do here for you or with you. And it's just, it was like one of those things that when it happens in the book, you're like, no, this is wrong. And then you're like, damn you, Stephen. How he knows these people so intimately well, so much better than I did. It just never ceased to amaze me or blow my mind when he would have them make a decision that was perfect for them. And I was just like, that's not the story, though. That's not how another author would have outlined it. That's not how anybody else would have done it. But it is perfect. And I just have to sit and stand in awe of his abilities to make some of these decisions as he's writing. It's just great. Anyway, with Susanna gone, at this point, Mordred attacks Roland, and the only reason that Roland is able to survive and take out Mordred is because Oy sacrifices himself in order to buy Roland enough time. Now, with Oy gone, Roland is finally alone. The Tet is finally broken completely. Nobody's left. Even the little animal companion is now gone. And we are officially at this point left with what we started with, a very alone Roland. Now let's talk about that bad climax. Because this is the one that's just bad, right? This is the one that I can't justify like I can with Walter. This is the one that just is unsatisfying and there's no way of saving it. And I don't know if it's like Stephen King wrote himself into a corner and didn't know how to get out of it, kind of like he did with The Stand, because he has said in interviews that he wrote himself into a corner with The Stand and he didn't know what to do, so he just kind of blew up half of the characters so he could figure out where to go with the story. But it's not good. Like, this is the most disappointing climax ever. And in hindsight, I don't think it serves the story. I can't justify its existence. And we are talking about, of course, the showdown between him and the Crimson King. And to be honest, I think this is just an example of King's writing style not always working out in the best possible way. like I said, and he is very open about the fact that he just writes and the stories revealed to him as it goes. The characters do what they're going to do as they do it. He doesn't plot it. He doesn't plan it. He doesn't outline it, which can be way better for the story experience in some of the decisions that he has made and some of the ways that it works out. Because giving the characters the ability to do things on the fly and as they make real character-informed decisions can be infinitely better than outlining the story from the get-go, because you will get people to do things that serve the plot and not serve the character. He is a character-first writer, and this is maybe one of the pitfalls of doing that kind of writing. It's not always better, is what I'm saying, because I think he got himself into a situation where he wrote this thread of the Crimson King in the story, and it wasn't necessary. Or he didn't really know how to resolve it once he got to the end. He gets here, he gets him to the tower, he's got the king in the tower, and he's got Roland standing before it, and he doesn't know what to do with it or to do about it. And he wrote himself into a corner, maybe, and I think he just didn't know how to get himself out of this little pickle that he had written himself into, so he just erased him. And it is so unsatisfying. It is the worst. And I have no justification for it. I just can't be like, technically, if you think about it, it sucks. I mean, I would imagine poor Stephen spent 30 years writing this entire story just to get to the end and be like, oh, shit. Now what? Because ultimately he had to get rid of him. And I guess the one thing I can say is that ultimately he did have to get rid of him, because the story never really was about the ultimate climax between Roland and the Crimson King at the Dark Tower. No, that's not what this story's about. This story is about Roland and his journey and his trip to the tower. And the most appropriate ending for it is for Roland to approach the tower alone by himself, calling out the names of his fallen comrades. And as much as that is true, and as much as we just kind of needed to be rid of the Crimson King so that that could happen, it still felt like a cop-out. It still feels like a cop-out. It still feels like a misstep for the series in general. But anyway, now we do get what we came for. We do get Roland approaching the tower. We do get him calling out the names of his comrades as he approaches and he enters the Dark Tower. And you feel every second of that final approach, because as he calls the names, you remember every single one of them, and you grew to love them so much, and you had to watch every single one of them go, even if it was his childhood friends like Cuthbert and Elaine, because we got an entire 600-page flashback with just them, just enough time to love them too. So as he goes up and every name he calls out, you feel it every step of the way. And it is so fulfilling as a reader to get to this section of the book. It is madness. Now we get a quick epilogue with Susanna as she emerges from the door that she had drawn for her, and she ends up running into Eddie and Jake, but they're like alternate reality versions where they're actually brothers, but they don't know her, but she knows them, and it's just like a nice little happy ending that he kind of gives us. It's not the real them, and they're not going to have the relationships that we've grown to come to know and love, but they at least are going to get some semblance of a story where they get an ever after. We won't even say happily ever after, because who in Stephen King's world, who's ever really happy, right? It's just they get to have an existence, and it's not the one that they built. It's not the one that they developed. It might not even be a good one. They just get to have an existence. And that's, in all fairness, that's enough. And then he even considers that a happy ending and warns the readers to just stop there and don't go further. I don't know at what point King knew that this was the ending, but at a certain point in writing, this came into real stark focus for him. I don't think he always necessarily knew how he was going to get here, and I really don't think he knew how people were going to handle it once he did. But once he knew that this is the ending, this is the only ending, this is the only way this story ends, there was no avoiding it for him. There was no, well, maybe I'll just do it differently. No, this is what was going to be written. I think it was just an inevitability, and it had to be written, and it had to be completed. Anyway, Roland climbs the tower, and as he climbs the tower, he passes room after room, floor after floor, level after level, going through and seeing his experiences and seeing his life and seeing the major events that led to who he is and who he was and everything that he ultimately became. And he climbs all the way through, basically re-experiencing his life from the ground up till he gets to the top of the tower. He gets to the door at the top, and he opens the door and he steps through the door into the desert. And the second he emerges from that door into the desert, you understand what just happened and where we are and exactly what kind of a cyclical nature this has. Everything that he's been feeding you up until this point, renewal, rebirth, re-this, re-that, everything snaps into focus and you're like, are you fucking serious? Like, this is what this has all amounted to? We're gonna do this again? Roland is gonna do this again? And it hurts. And then he writes those last few pages and you just, everything inside of you sinks and you feel every word of every page as the haze falls over his eyes and he starts to forget everything. Oh, but he kind of remembers it, but he doesn't. And it's like his mind melds between the end of book 7 and the beginning of book 1, and it just flows together, and it's just written so painfully well, and it hurts so bad to read it. And it is the most utterly impactful thing to read, and it feels so real. And suddenly the books aren't about anything that the books have been about up until this point. I know every book that's ever written, well, you know, technically that book wasn't about a gunslinger going up against the end of the world. I know. You know, RoboCop isn't really about a robot cop. I get it. Everything has deeper meanings and themes and allegories that run through them. But for me, this one hit so much harder and deeper than anything else because everything that has been told to us for 7 books straight, everything that he's gone through, everything that he's done just struck a chord with me, and it hit home so deeply. I personally, for my entire life, have suffered through major depression and bipolar, and I've struggled with a lot of things in my life. And this is a representation of struggle. This whole series is a representation of mental struggles. From depression to addiction, which is Stephen King himself was a severe drug addict for a lot of years. And he has a way of writing certain things into this and allegories, like I said, that just touch so deeply within that kind of a mindset. And like I said, I personally have had depression and bipolar, and I've struggled with excessive drinking and things like that in my life, so that when we get to the end of it and we realize that this has been a vicious cycle and he has to do this again, and he climbed the tower. How many times has Roland climbed the tower just to step back out at the beginning, just where he started, just to have to make that whole struggle again? How many times have we climbed that damn tower just to come out the other side of the tower back into the desert, just to start again? And I know that he has the horn this time, and he could maybe do it this time because something's different, something's new. But you know what? Maybe he won't. And maybe he'll climb the tower again. And maybe he'll end up back in the desert again. I felt that. When he stepped down into the desert, I felt that. And the other things, just everything else starts to come into focus too. Just the things that we've been told over and over again. This is something you must do alone. I mean, how many times have you felt alone and nobody, the people who walk with you just die? Or must be a wicked man to deserve a life such as this. From the perspective of just deep, dark depression, you can get stuck in a rut and you can be in such a low place that you can be thinking about all of the horrible things that have happened to you and how horrible your life is. And then you can get preoccupied with one horrible thing, maybe one bad thing that you've done. And you perpetuate in your mind that you yourself are a bad person. And then you get stuck on that thought, and then you see how bad your life is, and you think, I just must be a horrible person. What kind of a wicked person deserves a life like this? And it just, oh my God, I could not have been more heavily impacted. I have not been more heavily impacted by any other book or book series in my entire life than this one. And it might just be because of the underlying themes, the underlying struggles, the mental compulsions and depression and just the mental struggles that this represents, and the cyclical nature of it, and the maybe next time will be the time that it just something works out. Maybe I will do it. Maybe I will succeed. Maybe next time. I will probably read it at least one or two more times before I die. And it has meant more to me than anything else I've ever read. And I can't express that enough. And I can't thank Stephen King enough for writing it. Anyway, as always, the link for my Discord's in the description below. The link for my Patreon's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and long days and pleasant nights.